All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today, we are diving into the life and career of Little Richard, so stick around. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at Tyler & Co. _marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything, when he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. All right, so when I dove into the story of Little Richard, it's a fascinating and complicated and kind of wild story. So Little Richard is another one of these guys that I love to talk about, where you can see his influence bounce off of all these other people that we've covered on the show, and kind of he was, in a way, like if you judge by our other episodes, he's kind of in the background of a lot of these stories, but he had his, like, he may have invented main character energy. Little Richard was just so over the top and so flamboyant and so out there. And his whole life was a kind of a struggle to get recognition that he felt like he didn't get. And it wasn't that he wasn't a rock star at the time, he was, but it's a kind of a tragic struggle for his own kind of sense of self here. And so it starts off, he's born in 1932 in Macon, Georgia. And that, for whatever reason, like, people from Macon love to say the word Macon, Georgia. Like, they're just like, I'm from Macon, Georgia. Like, they always make sure they throw it in there. And it's like a point of pride. And so he's, but he's born, I think he's the third of 12 kids. And it's a struggle from the jump. They are not they're not well off. They don't have a lot of money laying around. And he's also born with a bunch of like physical handicaps. So like one leg is longer than the other, one arm is longer than the other, one of his eyes is bigger than the other. And so right off the bat, he's fighting an uphill battle for his, his image here. And obviously being in the South in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, this is full-on Baptist church. This is where he learns to sing. And his parents, his dad was a Baptist minister, but they went to two different churches. And he talks about like the different experience of one church was super kind of reserved and nobody's singing, nobody's, getting too, excited. And then the other church, it's just a party and everybody's, full on jumping around and singing and having a great time. And that's what he gravitated towards. And his early religious roots make a serious impact on him. And he never, his life kind of goes on the rock star trajectory. He goes off and, he has a pretty debaucherous life for most of it here, but he's always really drawn back to his religious kind of sense. And he actually, he may get the most religious towards the end of his life, the last couple of decades. But so he's always quoting the Bible to people. He's always talking about Jesus, and he's always like kind of proselytizing at the same time as he's doing full on rock star behavior. So he's got this weird Jekyll and Hyde kind of thing going on. And, but that comes later, but it comes from this, initial experience growing up in church and his dad being a minister. But his dad was kind of a wild character because he was a minister, but he also like owned nightclubs and some pretty wild nightclubs. Like there's some pretty crazy stuff going on here. But anyway, so as he's growing up, he's, starting to get recognized for his voice and for his kind of stage presence wasn't the right word back then because he's like one of a choir, but he would kind of stand out in the group. And the other thing that he kind of had working against him here is from a very early age, he was a very effeminate boy. And by the time he was like 7 or 8 years old, he's stealing his mom's like pins and brooches and he's wearing them around. He starts putting makeup on when he's pretty young. And his dad is just not into this at all. And and his dad was really hard on him, like from the jump here. Like, and there's interviews where you can see little Richard, he's like crying in interviews talking about his relationship with his dad because, there wasn't a lot of warm and fuzzies there. His dad was first of all, his dad was already kind of mean to him about his physical deformities, which is kind of wild. But then also he was just pretty nasty to him on the femininity front. Like he kept telling, this is a little kid and he's telling him like, I wanted 7 sons, but you're messing it up for me, kind of. And so he's just, it gets pretty contentious here pretty quick. So by the time little Richard's in high school, he basically has come out as being gay. Like he leans into that and his dad kicks him out of the house. Like he's not welcome at home, sends him off, to be on his own in town. But before this had happened, he'd already kind of gotten a decent following going. And when he was 14, there was an artist called Sister Loretta Tharpe, and she was a killer vocalist and just a kind of blues musician, gospel musician. And she was on that same circuit. And I think when he was 14, he gets the chance to sing during her show. Like she brings him on stage and kind of gives him this big pat on the back. And she said something like, there's a boy back here who can out-sing me all day long or something like that. Like she gives him this big recognition moment. And that really kind of helps light the fire under him. But so then when he gets kicked out, he, like I said, there's this something that I am just learning about here in the South and in this period of time, because you got to remember, this is still segregation. This is not like things are not bright and shiny for the African-American community in, this period of time. And at that same time, within the black community, there's this underlying, kind of scene where there's all these like drag clubs and gay clubs and like these shows that they were doing that were just really leaning into the whole like cross-dressing thing. Like it was all just like, and there's like orgies going on and like just a crazy seedy scene as, I think they called it the Chitlin Circuit, which is all these clubs and, things that they would go out and do these shows. And they're singing songs with lyrics that'll, curl your hair. They're like, it's dirty, which they're kind of funny to listen to now. But like, if you listen to some of those songs and then you imagine that this is getting played in rooms full of people that like finished their day jobs in like the South in the 50s and, early 60s. Well, and even before that, these people are working all day long and then they go home, they put their dresses on or whatever else. They throw on all this makeup and they hit the clubs and they start doing all this like cross-dressing stuff. And that's where like, it wasn't just the gay community. It was all shades of this stuff. And this is kind of where little Richard sort of finds a home because he'd been kicked out and that community just kind of welcomes him in. And this is where he starts doing, like, he had an alter ego is not the right word, but he would be part of these drag shows. And I think it was Sister Levon or Mrs. Levon was the name, but he had this where little Richard would put on a dress and a bunch of makeup and a wig, and he'd come out on stage as a woman and, put these shows on. And And like I said, he did that for, a couple of years here. Well, while he's doing that, he's also like, he's starting to get recognition from other artists. And this is where we start to run into the same period of time where we talked about on our episode where we talked about the payola scandals with Alan Freed and Dick Clark. Alan Freed is, Little Richard is one of these artists that Alan Freed is shining a light on his Moondogger radio show. And that comes a little bit later, but you can imagine like same kind of time frame, same kind of culture that's going on. And so you had like the racism of America at the time on the music front is starting to crumble a little bit because white kids are buying records from black artists because the music is great. And there's kind of the first wave is acceptance from the white kids that are buying these records. And then the next wave, excuse me, the next wave is their parents being like, we're not doing this. And this is where all the resistance comes in after. But that first wave is just like acceptance everywhere. Records are flying off the shelves. People are into the music. And this is happening to everybody at the same time. So this happened to Chuck Berry and Little Richard and, all these people. So as he's starting to get some recognition here, I think it was in 1951, he gets on with RCA Victor. And hold on, I wanted to go a little bit before that, though, because he joins another band, and he changed his stage name to Little Richard in 1949. And this is where he's meeting people like Billy Wright and, Roy Brown and other people he's kind of starting to hone his style and his skill. And he's adopting some, like his piano playing style. He's very, banging on the keys and jumping around on stage. Like if you watch Little Richard perform, you see the connection here, like between like Jerry Lee Lewis picked up some of his style from Little Richard here. Like they were kind of working at the same time and they worked together a lot, but you can see how they kind of bled into each other and kind of how the style of the time starts to kind of coalesce. But the thing that seems to be purely Little Richard's is the flamboyance. So like if you look at artists like, especially the white artists at the time, it was very, suit and tie, you're up there standing up straight, singing, really enunciating all your words. And then even the black artists, like Chuck Berry, he's out there wearing a suit and he's, he's still putting on a hell of a show, but he's dressed professionally, at least early on. Little Richard's coming out there in like mirror suits and pink things. And like, he's just full on flying his own flag, wearing makeup and just he was just breaking all the, something that we kind of take for granted now. Like even now, the person that comes to mind, people that come to mind now are like Prince or Bruno Mars. That part of their style is tied directly to Little Richard. And that would become part of the story later because Little Richard would meet, all these people. And him and Prince had a pretty interesting relationship where it wasn't like they both acknowledged each other as being great artists, but there wasn't a lot of warm and fuzziness there. It was competitive and there was some friction there. And I will get into why, but anyway, so the bright, bright colored suits and flamboyant on-stage persona, really Little Richard is kind of the guy that introduces this stuff, and he does it so well, so early on. And he's running into other artists like Buddy Holly and, some of these other guys that in that period of time, this is where you got to imagine Little Richard has come away from his religious roots pretty significantly here. Like he keeps talking about it, but action wise, he's living the rock star life. We're talking and he leaned pretty hard into like the sexual side of stuff where there's just like orgies happening constantly. There's drugs everywhere. There's alcohol everywhere. Like it's just a full on, no rules, hedonistic, chaotic scene here. And he starts to kind of burn out after a while, but not initially. So, and so much so, like kind of a weird hitch in the timeline here is where even though that's kind of going on, like it happened a little bit before he really got famous, but but he's living that lifestyle. But his music starts getting played on the radio and his records start to sell. And him and his dad actually kind of patch things up for a little bit because his dad starts to see him as this successful artist instead of, you know, his one effeminate son that couldn't do anything right. Once little Richard starts to get some success under his belt, then suddenly his dad, you know, is ready to make amends and lets him move back into the house. And little Richard starts kind of helping pay bills. He's working other jobs on the side too, like before his success really takes off. And things had kind of started to turn around for him, but this is where tragedy strikes the first time here, because in 1952, and I think little Richard was 19 at the time, they had just decided, like, they had just kind of patched things up. Little Richard basically told his dad, look, I can help kind of take care of the family, but I don't have a way to get around town. Like, can you help me get a car? And his dad is like, yep, sure. Well, I'll help you get a car if you help, you know, pay for bills. And so that was the deal they struck. They were supposed to go pick the car up on Friday or something. And earlier in that week, something happened. And there's not a lot of detail available on this story, but little Richard's dad and little Richard's best friend, whose name I think was Frank, somehow get in a shootout in front of his dad's club. And little Richard's best friend shoots and kills his dad, which then there's all kinds of weird, like I said, there's no good details about like what the argument was about or what led to it. It's just kind of, you know, and I think he does, his friend gets arrested at some point, but he's never convicted. And, you know, like I think even little Richard's mom had something to do with signing something about his warrant saying like, look, this is a mutual combat thing. Like these guys were shooting at each other. It wasn't like first degree murder or anything. They just got in an argument. Both of them pulled guns and they both got shot. So the friend also was wounded in the shootout, but he kills little Richard's dad. And clearly very tragic. And that really kind of helps pour gas on little Richard's substance spiral. And he never gets, you know, there wasn't enough time there for him to really heal a lot of that stuff that had been going on with his dad. So I think that's part of why in later interviews, he gets so emotional talking about it, how like, you know, the way his dad treated him is because like, that's kind of where that story ended. And there wasn't really a lot of time for that to heal over. And so, but anyway, so, you know, little Richard continues on and his career starts to kind of skyrocket here. And he ends up with Specialty Records in 1955. And he's doing kind of the same thing that Johnny Cash did, where they just like show up at the record label and they're just playing, or they're calling people and just like refusing to take no as an answer. They're getting turned down over and over and over again until he gets a yes. But this is where the music industry kind of pulls a weird bait and switch here, because where you would think that, hey, we're starting to get some success. What that record label did was they took Little Richard's songs and they sanitized them. And they even rewrote like the lyrics to Tutti Frutti. If you look at the original lyrics of Tutti Frutti, it belongs on the Chitlin Circuit. It is a song about gay intercourse. Like that's what that song is about. And it's very clear. It's not like a metaphor. It's not, I mean, it is like details. And he's playing it in this club, and, you know, some of the people from the record label hear it, and they're like, okay, we kind of bring in other songwriters. Like, can we clean this up and kind of make it a hit? And they do. And Tutti Frutti becomes this gigantic success. But it's mostly under other artists. So, you know, like, so it's Little Richard's song. He wrote it, and he does perform it. He does cut the record, and it does do well. But later, that song gets covered by Pat Boone, and Elvis Presley does a version of it, and which might be the most famous one. But it was kind of the first kind of run-in he had with really whitewashing his work. Because, I mean, on the one hand, you kind of understand it. Like, you can't put that raunchy of a song on the radio without fixing it up a little bit. But they kind of went even one step further and they pushed it out to these white artists that then really kind of brought it out to the world. And it's kind of funny because if you look at Pat Boone's performances, you really, it's a really clear example of the music scene at the time where like the black artists are dragging the music scene into the future and they're kind of breaking all these boundaries and rules. And the white artists are coming to it after the black artists make it okay. And they kind of pave the trail for them, but they're kind of resisting it as it goes. So here's little Richard just banging on his piano, singing and screaming and having a grand old time singing Tutti Frutti. And then you go watch Pat Boone do it. And it's very like wearing a suit, standing up straight, clicking his fingers, like, you know, and even the way he like enunciates his word, it's so funny to like go back and watch. If you compare the two that were happening at the same time, where, you know, little Richard is just full feeling in the music, full performance. And then Pat Boone's like, Tutti Frutti, oh, Rudy, like just super clean, you know, and like kind of dancing with a girl on stage. And like, and it, like I said, it did bring it to a wider white audience, but it was not like where you catch the discrepancy is where you see that Pat Boone's version of it performed so much better in sales and radio plays, even though just the quality of the two performances, Little Richard's version is clearly better. I mean, in every way, shape, and form, but Pat Boone's version is what, you know, kind of gets pushed out to the masses here. And then he also gets caught up, like you know, like I said, the payola scandals with Alan Freed and all this stuff is happening at the same time. And this is where Little Richard is starting to run into his legal troubles because he signed these contracts without even really reading them. I mean, he just, oh, I got a record deal. Great. We're making it. And then he's making like 50 cents per record sold on songs that he wrote when Pat Boone's doing them. And then when Elvis does it, and then, you know, I mean, you can see it both ways where it's like, on the one hand, you got a songwriting credit on something that Elvis is cranking out and selling millions of records doing. And so is Pat Boone. But, you know, so it's like, it's not like he's making no money, but as a percentage, it's way less than the industry standard, even at the time. And it becomes quite an issue. And this is where that's kind of the first time that the music industry starts to really kind of do him wrong. And you see him react to it. Like, I mean, really early on, his sense of ego just jumps to the front in all of these conflicts where he wants to be known as this trailblazer. And he even says he's the real king of rock and roll. And he says that on stage all the time. I am the true king of rock and roll. And to be fair, he did it first. And Elvis Presley later told him Elvis said the words, "You don't have anything to worry about for me. You're the real king of rock and roll." And this is also where I got some flack online for our Alan Freed episode because Alan Freed makes the claim that he invented the term rock and roll and that he did it as a way to kind of like, because rhythm and blues was black music and rock was white music and pop was white music. So he kind of blended the two with this new term rock and roll that didn't have the same kind of, you know, racial insinuations to it. That claim, lots of people will jump out and say like Alan Freed didn't invent that term. You know, it came from the black community and Alan Freed just put his name on it, which might be true. I mean, the things that I've seen from Alan Freed, I think he really believed that he came up with that term, even if it had been floating around in the ether before that. But like I said, so this is where rock and roll is getting its identity during this time. And Little Richard is a gigantic part of that struggle. And, but anyway, so like I said, success comes, drugs, alcohol, sexual adventures, the whole thing. And Little Richard cannot get enough. And, it starts to cost him a little bit. Like he, you know, same thing as a lot of other artists we've talked about where he's like doing so much cocaine that it's like chewing up his nose and he's like, you know, making him act pretty erratically on stage. And it's like, it's clearly becoming an issue here. But anyway, so as that's going on in the 60s, he goes, oh, also too, he gets married in 1959. So this is the first time that he starts to kind of come away from his gay identity, and he marries a woman and has a son. But that doesn't last very long, obviously. Like it was not, built to last here. But so, he kind of cleans up his image a little bit here. And then he ends up going on tour in Europe. And this is where he meets the Beatles in 1962. And when Little Richard meets the Beatles, they are nobody. Like, they're not a big name at all. They're a local band from Liverpool or whatever. And Paul McCartney just gravitates to Little Richard almost immediately. Like, he's just picking his brain all the time, asking him how he gets that like kind of high pitched scream going, and Paul McCartney's kind of teaching him. So you hear that in Paul McCartney's music from then on. It's like a direct fingerprint from Little Richard. And then he does the same thing with the Rolling Stones there later on, where like Mick Jagger will say openly that like we are a direct outgrowth of Little Richard, and he had a giant impact on our music. And it's weird because the artists themselves will give Little Richard the credit that he seems to think he deserves, but because the recognition isn't coming from the music industry at large, Little Richard still feels kind of slighted, and he feels like he's owed some recognition here. And he does that with a bunch of artists, like James Brown was in Little Richard's band for a while there. Like he was a backup vocalist, but would also cover for Little Richard when he missed a show. And so like he's helping bring up this whole next wave of artists that would go on to do just crazy successful careers. And but you can see him all kind of learning it from Little Richard. And then let's see here. So as we get into his kind of middle life here, I think it's let's see here, somewhere in here, it might have been before he got married again, actually. There's this bizarre story where he was on a plane. I think he was going to Australia. And I'm going to tell this story off memory because my notes aren't in front of me. But he's going to Australia, and there's some turbulence on the flight. He looks out the window and he sees what he described as a fireball going through the sky. And he said there's an angel on the wing of the plane. And he has this like religious experience. Supposedly what he saw was Sputnik being launched, but who knows if that's real or not. But whatever it was around the time the Sputnik gets launched. Little Richard sees this thing, and it has a full-on religious experience on this plane, and decides, I'm done with all of it. I'm done with all the debauchery. I'm going to be a minister. And he goes to a college for like ministry for a while. And this is the first time that he starts making the claims that like, I'm not gay anymore, and I used to be, but I'm not. And that was the first sign of trouble for him within his own community. Because you got to imagine all these friends that he had from the Chitlin Circuit and from all these, the people that had kind of supported him when his family kicked him out. Suddenly, he kind of turns his back on that whole community, and he doesn't do half measures here. He's like full on talking about like why it's biblically wrong. And that same brashness and that same stage presence he brings to the like telling the world why being gay is wrong and bad, and so he kind of burns a lot of bridges with some of his early friends. But and he does a gospel album somewhere during this time, and he really is kind of leaning into his his religious roots here. But like I said, it doesn't last very long at first here, because he goes back on tour, and within a couple of dates, he's right back into the lifestyle. And he just picks it right back up where he left off. And his wife at the time was obviously, she did not sign up for that. So I'm pretty sure that's what, kind of puts the nail in the coffin of that first marriage. But, so he had his first blip of telling everybody he's straight now, and he used to be gay, but now he's not. But then he kind of goes right back into the scene here for a while. And like I said, it starts to this is where I start to see why he didn't get the recognition that he felt like he wanted. Because the rest of his career, when he talks, it's always him being like, well, I did this and I did that and I brought up this person and I brought up that person and people don't know. And, and because I think he was fighting kind of a three-front battle anyway. Like, he was already like a black artist with a bad contract. Like, so all other things aside, that's already an uphill battle to have to fight up against. Like, Chuck Berry had the same kind of career path up to then. And like, the two of them were very similar artists working at the very, same time in the same circuits, doing the same things. And so to make the claim that he was just repressed by the music industry because of racism, well, Chuck Berry succeeded through all that stuff. Like, there are other artists that had the same challenge there and made it. Well, then it was like, oh, well, it's because he was gay. Well, when he was outwardly gay, the money was flowing in and that wasn't an issue. Like, people loved him for that. The real hit, I think, is the first time he kind of burns that bridge with that community. And now not only is he in the same struggle as, other black artists, he's also just burned a giant community of people that were supporting him up to that time. And it makes his life pretty difficult here. And, and like I said, he goes on this kind of run where he's back in the scene and he's bumping into more people, having a huge impact on more bands and kind of doing his thing. But he, I think in 1977, he retires again and he goes back to his religious side. And this is where you get some bizarre interviews where he's on TV now talking about, like, I've been gay my whole life, but now I'm not. And, I've been saved and God told me that he made Adam and Eve and not Adam and Steve. And like, he's saying this stuff on a televised, like he's on like, I don't remember exactly what show it was, but it was like, similar to the Tonight Show or something big like that. And he's saying all this stuff and it's not going over great. But he leans into that. And after the late 70s, early 80s, he'll reference that he like he says at one point, like, oh, I've been gay all my life, but now I'm not, kind of thing. Like, so he always admits to having been gay up to then. But after the early 80s, his persona is like the guy that successfully prayed the gay away. And like, he doesn't drop that for the rest of his life. I don't think. I mean, who knows what's going on behind the scenes, but at least outwardly, he never leans back into the debauchery and that kind of community. And he's really outspoken against it. And like I said, I think that really, in that context, knowing that he is kind of taking that route, then you see him running into artists like Prince and Michael Jackson and, even James Brown later. Or like, up to then, and like their relationship would change kind of down the road. But you kind of start to see why some of those artists might not have just been warm and fuzzy and hugging all the time, because he had taken such a staunch stance against the gay community, which, like that would, if I was Prince, I don't know about alienating that crowd because that's a big chunk of his fan base. And, like just seems like a morally weird thing to do, to just kind of sell out your base like that. But he does. And his career never really comes back fully. He's still performing. He's getting all kinds of awards. Like he's getting, I think he's got to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but I can't remember what year that happened in. And, but he tours with Otis Redding. He's doing like the AIDS benefit concerts. He's doing like, so he's around the scene, but he never kind of peaks again after that, I don't think. And I mean, and he starts, and this is where he works with Jerry Lee Lewis later. And I kind of like, I'm thinking about that, the idea that him and Jerry Lee Lewis would work together in this, in the 2000s, which is like a pretty weird time for both of those dudes. because Jerry Lee had the same kind of gripes about his career getting sunk, but he earned those. Like Jerry Lee Lewis got his career sunk because he went to Britain with his 13-year-old child bride that was his second cousin, and the media found out about it, and that's what burned his career to the ground. But they both have the same kind of like, oh, well, I didn't get the recognition that I deserve. It's like, well, at least in Jerry Lee's case, there's a pretty solid reason there. And but anyway, so the two of them performing together as like these ostracized, like both of them had the same, like I can just imagine Jerry Lee being like, yeah, they never understood us. And I can just imagine like Little Richard being like, us, like, like I didn't do what you did. Like, but anyway, so yeah, they do team up there for a second for a duet. And I think they record some records together, I think. But anyway, so they, that starts to be, you can see his career kind of slowly kind of drifting into history here because there's never a giant peak again. But he does, so by the end of his, life here, I think he becomes a Seventh-day Adventist, which has, to go from being a Baptist to a Seventh-day Adventist, like to watch his arc of belief structure change and then watch some of the interviews that he does and the sermons that he's being a part of. Like he gets right out there in that community and he's being a front man. And it's kind of odd to watch him give those speeches and sermons knowing his history and kind of knowing what he's built out of, like, cause he never stops with the, like there was a time there, especially the first time that he quit, where he like stops with the makeup. He shows up in a regular suit. He's got his hair done like kind of clean and there's no frills going on here. But in the, after this time, he kind of hangs on to a little bit more of it. I don't think he's wearing makeup really anymore, but he's wearing kind of flashier suits and he's kind of got his hair, done in different ways to kind of be, draw attention to himself. But yeah, he keeps this attitude of like, I am the best, like I'm the greatest and everybody else learned from me and they should all be thankful to me kind of thing. He even gets on a couple of award shows. It might've been for Chuck Berry. There's a couple of different ones where he's out there. I think for Chuck Berry, he's actually very sweet and very like, Chuck, you're the best and we couldn't have done this without you. And kind of, I don't think he doesn't throw any flack at Chuck Berry during that award ceremony, but there are others where he's like, like he said, like the next winner of this is me. And then everybody kind of like, ha, 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 and then he reads the actual winner. But you can see his ego is very bruised, where he's at these award shows and he's not the one getting recognized. And what's funny is that like the other thing he did, like I said, his religious attitude and underpinnings were so powerful in there, but he would bounce around to other stuff. He even toyed with Judaism for a while, which I thought was just so funny. Cause like I saw an interview where he like talks about himself as being like, I was just a Jewish boy from Macon, Georgia. And I was like, Jewish? Like, like nobody saw that coming. Like he makes this claim during an interview and like as a list of the reasons why like he's not getting the recognition. And then you realize that like he's not Jewish by like birth or anything, but he did like supposedly he converted to Judaism at some point. He maintained some like of the like kosher practices and he was going to synagogues for a while there, but that part was like just 100% self-inflicted. So it was kind of funny to see him like grab that as like the last infinity stone of oppression and being like, he's gay, black, and Jewish. And like, he just makes that claim kind of for no outwardly apparent reason. But, and like I said, he doesn't hang on to that claim, for very long. You see him say it in a couple of pretty prominent interviews. But he lands with the Seventh-day Adventists and he's with them, I think, till his death in 2020. So Little Richard dies during the pandemic. And obviously tributes just pour in because everybody, it's easy once somebody dies to like pour on the accolades and the, acknowledgments, which really that's kind of when it rolls in for him. But up to then, he had kind of maintained that attitude of like not being recognized at the level that he should. And like I said, some of that conflict was pretty dang self-inflicted, especially when it comes to other artists that learned from him that were getting way more success than he had ever gotten, even with the same challenges that he had. I mean, or at least many of the same challenges that he had. But like I said, there's no denying his impact and his even just his style. Like I said, when you go watch, Prince when he was alive or Bruno Mars today, like that style is like, I don't know if we get that without Little Richard, and that like just flamboyant, outward, loud, performative, just rock star that he was. And so, you see it carry on today, and that's, it's cool to know where all that kind of started here. And it was, because Little Richard just would not take no for an answer, and he just was not into conforming to things to make people comfortable. Very outspoken, very confrontational at times, but kind of guided by his own star of success. But yeah, so he's definitely a giant part of the story of American music, and I think we're all better for it. So that's Little Richard. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you next week.